I am Sarah Erickson, and I have the privilege of working with Stephen Fetter and Joshua Lundy-Whitler and Rick Rouse and Erica Knisely as part of the Alumni Leadership Team. And we are hosting this webinar this afternoon, and we are delighted to have such a good-sized group that has joined us and is going to probably join us for the next several minutes. This is the first webinar for us for 2021. And as is our general custom, Stephen Fetter serves as our tech host. He will give a little bit of a very little bit of a tech overview and an opening prayer. And then he will turn it over to Sophia and her team, who will lead us in their presentation and, most importantly, conversation and dialogue about collaborating in lifelong learning. I am very grateful to Amy, Sophia, and Laura for agreeing to join us to kick off this first webinar of the new year. And I will turn it over to Stephen.
I've been invited to open with prayer, and I keep this candle handy because when I'm not working for the United Church of Canada, I'm a minister in a congregation in Toronto. And these days with the pandemic going on, I do all the worship services from here. So you can see my worship setup, and we always open our worship with the lighting of a candle and inviting God to be with us. And so we'll do that again as we gather. Take a moment. Take a moment to reflect on the world we're living in, the struggles and the conflicts and the anxieties, the places where we long for light. And we'll light a candle and invite God to be with us in the midst of our conversation, trusting that the work we do together reaches beyond our work and that it is indeed part of God's work. And so let us pray. Loving God, we bring thanks. We bring thanks for this time together, for this awesome vocation of studying and reflecting on ministry. Come be with us. Come help us to hear. Come deepen our thoughts and strengthen our perspective. Keep us open to curiosity and excited by what we're discovering. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I just wanted to let you all know I have a few folks in my home from 8 months to 12 years old that are doing school and other things. So if you hear them pop in, I know you know this, but I just wanted to call that out. We're excited to be here with you today. We're joining you from the greater Nashville area, and I'm actually in the Northwest this week with my family to talk with you about what our process and experience has been like as we have relaunched lifelong learning at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And we'll give you more context about what that has looked like, given a new chancellor and a few new priorities with the university in which we are embedded. But we just want to express again, thanks for the invitation and this time together that we hope will be meaningful and useful, and a time that we can really share and offer, again, the experience that we have had that we're actually still going through. We're sharing with you up until this point, kind of the process that we've gone through from conceptualizing what this program could look like to then beginning to build partners through Coursera and other folks across campus. So a brief introduction to the team. The three folks who you see on the top line, my name is Sophia Angarap. I'm the communications director at the Divinity School. I've been with Vanderbilt Divinity since 2017. My background is in education and in communication. And so this has been a really exciting opportunity to be able to bridge some of those pieces together as we think about what this could look like, not just for the Divinity School, but across campus and the region. Laura and Amy, would you like to go next?
I'll go next. I'm Laura Heifetz. I'm the Assistant Dean of Admissions. I have been at Vanderbilt just over a year and a half, obviously the best year and a half to join in recruitment work. I am originally from the Pacific Northwest, but have worked in religious publishing and theological education all over the US. So I've been in the Southeast for about 10 years, and I'm excited to be at Vanderbilt. And as you can tell, there are dogs in my house. I'll try to keep it muted.
Hello, everyone. We love keeping things exciting. And I don't have dogs, but I do have a teen. So maybe there's some similarities. We'll find out. Um, I'm Amy Steele. I serve at the Divinity School as the Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Community Life. I am also a long-term adjunct instructor in the areas of spirituality and ethics, just simply because I also have a PhD from Vanderbilt University, the Graduate Department of Religion. And so they allow me to teach every now and then, right? I have served in this position as Student Affairs and Community Life Assistant Dean for about almost 10 years, but am newly with my colleagues serving on the Lifelong Learning Committee. And I'm happy to be here with you all to host a conversation. So, thank you. And then the other two folks, I'll just briefly say that you see on screen. Dean Armour, Dr. Ellen Armour is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also teaches in the area of theology. And then Shatika Brown is our Program and Events Coordinator. They are, two folks that are a part of the team as well. And then we're going to talk a little bit later about the ways in which we collaborate with other folks at the university.
So, sorry, I have to move my chat screen. Amy, do you want to go over sort of the brief description of today, and then I can go into our agenda for our time together?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sophia. Basically today, as you can see on screen, we are asking several questions and wanting to engage in conversation with you all. So I'm just going to read our description. Vanderbilt Divinity School is reviving its lifelong learning under new leadership during a pandemic, right? And multiple crises in the United States. So we asked the question, why now? And how can faculty provide valuable input? How can lifelong learning serve as a strategic purpose? And how can lifelong learning cultivate more public religious discourse in your area? And we invite you to join us in discussion of what can be learned from the process, which uses, and we'll say more about this a little bit later, but uses a tripod team approach guided by particular commitments to inclusion, public engagement, and social change. And so there in the description, we've tried to describe multiple things, sort of what the kinds of questions that have shaped our work from the very beginning, and also engage you, because we, that's part of the discussion. We want to find out sort of the origins of your programs, if you have them. Maybe you're at the very beginning stages, but we want to learn more about that. And then we want to talk about, we want to talk a little bit more about the team approach and what it looks like to have collaborative partners. So again, thank you.
So just a brief sort of bullet point list of what we'd like to share with you today, but again, open for a conversation. I think as things emerge in the conversation, if there are points where it makes sense to stop and focus more on that, this is really just a guide. We hope that this is, again, a conversation that we can tailor to be the most useful for those who are present today. So some of the things that we'd like to go over today really are what are our commitments to our partners, why this particular moment. I know that for many, working and learning from home has afforded us the opportunity to explore projects and initiatives that we might not necessarily have entertained prior to this sort of setting. Amy mentioned that we have this sort of tripod approach that we'd like to go over and share why it has been important for us to find sort of a team at the Divinity School that can represent most broadly sort of our constituents, but also who can bring in voices and concerns from across the school, so that we are making sure that we have kept in mind how this might be valuable and important for admission, not just admissions, but like recruitment and retention, what this looks like for student and spiritual life, what this looks like sort of for the academic piece, and then for other events that we might be putting on at the school. We'll share what we have learned so far. And again, this has been a process and will continue to be a process, especially as we think about, though we might have faculty who have expressed great enthusiasm about this, what it looks like then to take a piece of curriculum and then turn it into digestible chunks that might be delivered in this way, which is quite different from perhaps a semester-long course. And then what are the expectations that we set, and what are the ways that we are measuring what success looks like in all its varied forms? How are we collecting that information? And who do we consider our stakeholders, and who has say in how we're designing this, how we're delivering it, and then again, what success looks like as we kind of go through this cycle.
And let me just say before I sort of talk about how we're anchored in the school's commitments, let me just say that, generally our purpose is to launch a lifelong learning program, but really more specifically, our goal is to broaden the Divinity School's religious conversation partners, to cultivate new learners, to curate more public religious dialogue around theological and moral ideas. We really know now more than ever that words like Christian nationalism and white supremacy and homogeneity, for instance, are already in the public domain. And so we really want to curate the kinds of conversation that privilege understanding and context and transformation for the sustainability of human society. And so I know that sounds so grand, but really what we're after is we're after, creating a lifelong learning program that really is interested in a larger kind of public formation, not just what we sort of understand in terms of the students that we attract in degree programs, but what does it look like to broaden those conversation partners and really make an impact on our society? So we really start with this idea of our commitments. And so, really what we're getting after here is inviting folks to start out thinking about the anchoring documents of your institution, right? The mission, the vision statement, the curriculum, maybe the degree goals, ATS standards, all of those things that sort of anchor the institution. And for us, along with those things that I named, are the Living the Commitments document, which is a document that has gone through several iterations over the years. It's a document that was written by faculty and students. And so it sort of, has in a way an oral history. It has sort of it's taken on an oral history, and it lives in various kinds of ways. And we can talk about that if there are questions, but it is one of our anchoring documents, one of our anchoring ideas. And basically the Living Commitments document, it contains community organizing principles that focus our attention on the curriculum and on our community life. So rightly, the commitments figure in our conversations around continuing education as a branch of our curriculum. In a way, this echoes, again, I referenced before the call with Stephen, his sort of webinar and conversation with Dr. Yamada, Frank Yamada, back in July of 2020, the webinar where Dr. Yamada talks about formation, right? Formation as the core mission of the school. And so really what we're trying to get at, and what the commitments in our location and our institution is really trying to get at again, is a particular kind of formation, a formation towards social justice, if you will. And now sort of, again, beginning to think about the commitments as formation for social justice with our students, but now as a branch of the curriculum, the commitments now as formation with and in continuing education. And just for reference, if if you're taking notes or want to make a note, Dr. Frank Yamada was getting at standard 3.5 in the ATS standards, which is really all about sort of formation. It's open-ended and rightfully so, because formation looks very different across the board of theological schools. So what we're getting at here in this slide is what anchors an institution's curriculum and its community life. And for us, what anchors is really, this document, the commitments, lots of other things, but this document is really central for us.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about why now do we get to relaunch this initiative. So I worked in theological education for the first time during the 2008 recession, and Barbara Wheeler of Auburn just said, never waste a good crisis. So in some ways, we're trying to not waste this crisis. Vanderbilt Divinity faculty have not been the type to embrace teaching distance or using other electronic means, typically speaking. And so because there is university support for the kind of technology that we could use for lifelong learning that is distance or digital, and they actually have invested a lot of funds into that technology. It's now available for everyone at the university, which is also very different. There was almost no, I would say very little investment prior into the technology that we would need to have some effective programming. And people were obviously forced to learn how to use it during the pandemic. And we they ended up being test cases, but in trying to make sure that we were having important conversations, we ended up with some really high viewership numbers that I think really blew the faculty away. I'm not convinced that I was particularly surprised, but some of them were really surprised just at the kind of response and enthusiasm out in the broader world, which makes sense, if people have not had easy access to these folks, but know about them or know of them or are really hungry for this kind of content, that they're going to end up getting the kind of reach that they want. And because every school is unique in the strengths that it brings, this is where VDS has been kind of forced into figuring out, okay, how do we draw on our strengths and share that with the broader community? So the nice thing is that this kind of kicked us into gear to do what we've been talking about internally or thinking about internally for a while. And we have a new chancellor at Vanderbilt University who's really committed to lifelong learning. And because we have that leadership from the top, that is basically pushing the whole university that's been very reluctant to do a lot of this and provide the support, then that really helps out our cause as well, which is exciting. And of course, the dean has been supportive and has really championed it to the chancellor. And so in some ways, we're able to be at the forefront of some of these efforts because we had already kind of started developing a lot of this. So we do have a question for all of you if you'd like to put your response in the chat. What is your school uniquely positioned to offer the broader community? Just because each of us comes from a place with such a unique character and different strengths. So we had thought, when we thought about this, which actually really helped guide some of our content, as well as how we might deliver the content, is that the Vanderbilt Divinity has always led the discussion in a lot of circles on anti-oppression, whatever that means, whether it's against apartheid in South Africa, or whether it's for women in leadership, or anti-racism, but hasn't always had the staff or the technology to really get that out there. So we thought, okay, that's actually the easiest thing, the lowest hanging fruit for us to start with, since we're known for that and we already have that kind of content available to us, fairly accessible. It'd be easy to produce it.
If others want to share and just unmute yourself, we'd love to hear how you've been thinking about that question that Laura posed.
This is great. So I'm seeing some about focused on Catholic Jewish dialogue, interreligious conversations between Christian, Muslim, or Buddhist foci, intercultural competence and undoing racism consulting and trainings. It's great. Anyone else want to speak it out loud or type it?
Can you hear me? Okay, we're here in the nation's capital, Howard University School of Divinity, and we, of course, boast of the Howard Thurman, Thurgood Marshall, and now Kamala Harris. So we certainly focus on a lot of racial justice type issues.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what I'm thinking about, that. What do you already have? That's kind of the obvious answer, and starting there. I also see some folks have said Indigenous conversation, Muslim conversation, leadership workshops, and support for terminated clergy and church leaders. Seems very timely. The faith we share, learning from Muslim and Jewish friends. And a program for it's the United Church of Canada. So training in church procedures, boundaries, racial justice, theological reflection, and vocation in young adults, Hispanic church leadership.
And Erica, your comment in the chat, I think, is an interesting one. Because as Laura mentioned, there are some things that are sort of the low-hanging fruit, what we have a lot of, or what we've already been committed to, and so there's content ready to go, or that is not going to take as long to develop. But then I think many of us are also in a position to ask the question, what makes our offerings distinctive? What do we have, as Laura put it, that is sort of distinctly or uniquely ours that we can offer that perhaps no one else is doing or not many others are doing? Mm-hmm. And I also wonder sort of then what the process is like to then decide, like, these are the things that we are going to be about. And some of that is committed back to or tied to Amy's points earlier about what are sort of those guiding or foundational documents that you continue to refer to, whether it's a document of purposes and commitments, whether it's sort of denominational pieces, if you're a denominationally affiliated school, whether it's what is it that is kind of anchoring you? And then what is that vetting process going to look like as you decide this is what we're going to offer and this is what we're going to commit to? And I think that's a place that we are in now at the Divinity School at Vanderbilt, kind of making those decisions. What do we want to be our, as you put it, distinctive stamp?
Well, and this is Sarah. Sometimes when we're looking at what we do, is sometimes things have a shelf life, and if they once were a good idea, it doesn't mean that they will never be a good idea again, but maybe it's time to put them back on the shelf to make room for something else, and to then consider whether you bring it back or not, because most of us, as Laura mentioned, we don't have infinite resources, technology or people. And we can't keep adding without subtracting or making different kinds of room.
That's a good point. And I think one of the considerations that we've been asking, or one of the questions we've been asking, is what sort of has legs, what's a little bit more evergreen in terms of topic. Like, we're not necessarily teaching things that are tied to a particular moment, but more broadly speaking, what are the skills and other sort of things that we can teach and offer that one can sort of carry with them as they continue to do this work. So it's not necessarily tied to a particular moment, though, as we see, we are seeing echoes of many moments, right, coming forward again, and the skills that civil rights leaders and organizers from the 50s and 60s have been using continue to find their way, related to nonviolent civil disobedience. But what are those things that are evergreen that can also be repurposed? Because again, we're not talking about any of us having large staff or any staff, right? All three of us are volunteers, so we don't even have instructional designers. We're relying on the university to help with that. But what can we develop that that does have legs and that can be repurposed for other settings, so that we're not having to recreate something new every single year if we don't have to?
Thanks everyone for your contributions. And I imagine for a lot of us, this may end up being the moving target, the distinctive, also based on what, because there cannot be just like one specialty per place, right? Sometimes we have multiple and overlapping. So thank you for sharing.
And before we move on to the tripod approach that we'd like to share with you all, this, I think, particular moment in working and learning remotely has also reminded us that our partners and collaborators don't have to be in the same region. And so we can be working with folks across the globe. And we think about working sort of smarter, not harder. What partners can we collaborate with that have expertise, or that we can build off of one another, so that we're not having to take on, all of the instructional design and all of the content creation on our own, but we are in the same way sort of amplifying others that might not necessarily have the platforms that we have, or the reach that we have, to then be able to share all of those learnings and expertise in a way that might not have existed before, or a way that we might not have entertained before. This tripod approach that we have mentioned before is really considering sort of three areas within the school. And the first is admissions, recruitment, but also retention. So Laura's over much of that: student formation and development. I would even say spiritual life, and then communications. And so I represent communications. Amy has represented student formation and development, Laura, admissions, recruitment, and retention. And having representatives from these areas, I think, has really enabled us to think broadly about the implications of the type of courses and content that we're creating, and what the interest and reach might be to our varied audiences. And it also helps really integrate bigger pieces of theological education in conversation with offices within the Divinity School, but also more broadly speaking. And I think part of that has to do with, I think, our individual commitments. I think sometimes you just get put on committees because the dean has asked you to serve, and that's fine. But I think this happened to be one of those moments where we all, the three of us at least, and I would say all of us who are a part of this team in some way, also have a deep commitment to quality theological education. We are all active in our congregations, whether we are serving as preachers or leads of the congregation, or in some lay capacity. We see the implications of this work beyond it being a program of a school. But we are so concerned, as many probably in this Zoom room are, about how we are training up folks to be strong moral leaders, not necessarily in the religious sense of the word, but to be good leaders who are able to discern what they're seeing in the media alongside what they believe their faith to profess, and skills that help kind of examine the world that we live in, and the congregations, which we are part of. And so I think one element to what has made this team work well is that we can see the implications in these communities that we are a part of. And so we understand like the praxis piece of it. I think we are also lifelong learners ourselves. And so when we are looking for content ourselves or classes to be a part of, I think we have sort of that in mind. So as we approach this work at the Divinity School and what it could look like to launch a lifelong learning or relaunch a lifelong learning program, we have sort of the learner also in mind, because we are those people who would seek this out on Coursera or Teachable or some other platform to say, this is what I thought I was going to learn. This is not actually what happened. And so to kind of keep even that life cycle of the learner in mind. I think the diversity of who is represented on our team, at least, I think also embodies, the expansive religious conversations that we hope to have and model for potential learners. I don't know, I think I've lost count of the number of folks who have reached out to ask if we had something to offer, whether it was continuing education or lifelong learning, because folks aren't able to necessarily find it. I think a lot of the platforms that exist currently have lots of, how to make sourdough bread or how to how to paint by number, which are all super helpful and interesting. But I think when it comes to sort of like a diverse, expansive theological education, unless you're willing to enroll in a degree program or certificate, there isn't a whole lot out there that exists that's really accessible for perhaps someone who hasn't had any theological training, or for someone who wants to deepen their learning, or someone who is a layperson that might never necessarily earn a degree, but they're very much interested in learning, or someone who has been out of seminary for 10, 15, 20 years and isn't necessarily enrolling in another program. So another question we wanted to pose for you is thinking about those who you would either hope to collaborate or who you currently collaborate with if you already have a program up and running. Are there new folks that you'd like to bring into the conversation that you perhaps haven't considered or entertained? And who are, like, if you're to make a list of, a handful of collaborators that you already have, whether those are dictated by relationships or processes and procedures that already exist in your institution, or whether those are collaborators that you have invited into the conversation as you've built your programs, who are those collaborative partners that you already have or that you hope to have?
And while folks are answering that, Sophia, let me just add too, that maybe, we mentioned the tripod approach, but, we also sort of have an octopus approach. There are many tentacles sort of in conversation with us. We, sort of being an embedded university, we're in conversation and collaborative partnership with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And folks there who specialize in educational design, which is really helpful. And then someone asked in the chat about alumni relations. Sophia has actually, with alumni relations, helped to create a survey. And so, our alumni from the very beginning, we wanted our alumni voices in this. We wanted to hear from them and to ask them to really question and gauge them on this question of, what are their needs? And so alumni relations, not in any necessarily formal sense, but they have helped us to craft the kind of survey that we hope will be very telling and help us sort of further guide the content that we curate in the lifelong learning program. So there are many sort of collaborative partners. We are rich in conversation partners, even our program folks. Some of you may know, or some of you might be in a similar situation where, there are separate programs that are funded through grant monies that do programming around, sort of certain ideas, intellectual ideas. And so at the Divinity School, at Vanderbilt Divinity School, many of our program directors are in direct partnership with us too. So we collaborate. We really collaborate with anyone who wants to have a conversation with us.
You've expressed interest. Great. We'll set up a meeting. I will say to our alumni, really, that has been kind of a resounding question from our alumni over the years to say, are you going to develop some sort of lifelong learning? And, to Laura's point, she mentioned earlier that we as a school just have not had whatever it is, capacity, interest, bandwidth, whatever, to have these online offerings. Like, we don't offer any courses online. And so now we've moved to completely online events. We're forced to do that, but in doing that, as we talked about earlier, folks have been made and convinced that this is actually a very interesting and important space to be. And in the past, when we do what could be considered lifelong learning, all of them were in person. And so I will say, even then, we were already thinking about our local congregations as being collaborative partners. There's a series called Relevant Religion that we would do in the fall and spring. And the last one we did in person was a collaboration of 5 different congregations, Jewish and Christian congregations, in an area about, within a 5-10 minute driving distance of the school. And they would take turns hosting these talks by our faculty at those spaces, and they were always sold out. And so clearly there was an interest and a need. But now that we're taking this from an in-person setting to online, I think it's just so fascinating to think about sort of reach, right? We think about our audiences and we talk about recruitment and, these schools are feeder schools, but we, I think, sell ourselves short when we forget that so many folks are looking for what we have to offer. It's just a matter of, again, finding the resources and the time to be able to put something together that would be accessible and interesting for these audiences. There's a good question here about international collaboration, but also thinking about different audiences. Could you say a little bit more about the different audiences? Is it perhaps not necessarily prospective students or those interested in theological education, but maybe CEOs who might want to learn about more about like gender and equity, those types of audiences?
Hi, thanks. I'm really open to it. I was talking with a group I belong to, a local interdenominational group. We have Muslim, Baha'i, and Jewish members as well. It's a group of women, and we know that we want to reach different audiences, and especially in light of all the justice issues that are surfacing right now. But I'm kind of riffing off of that conversation and about how traditional our work has been in the seminary. And I'm not in lifelong learning like you folks are, but I'm just wondering about equipping people to have different conversations, and maybe there's different hooks that we can use to interest people. I know that short courses have been especially attractive right now. People don't want to make really long commitments. And so I'm just wondering, maybe at our school, we're being true traditional and not thinking outside of all of our little circles or boxes, however you want to term it. So I don't really have an answer, but I just thought I'd kind of throw it out there for now.
Jenny, I think that's a really great question. And let me just add to that, very early on when we were, sort of trying to revive a program that was vibrant in the 90s, we were listening to our students. They were probably one of our first conversation partners. Every single year at the end of the semester, we perform exit interviews with our students, right? And, one of the questions that we ask every semester is around this question: and what would you like, or how would you like to stay connected to the school? And many of them, celebrate. They give us rich critique too, constructive critique on what was missing, while also celebrating all that they have gotten. But one of the things that we have really consistently heard over the years has to do with the more practical elements of ministry. And while that's not our whole program, our lifelong learning program, we do imagine, some of the more practical elements of ministry being an opportunity to develop a series. And so helping people, actually think through some of the things that they didn't get in class, because, sort of our curriculum is in many is very theory driven. And so, sort of picking back up on some of those ideas around how to do a baptism, what does it look like to baptize? What does it look like to offer ministry, for instance, in chaplaincy, street chaplaincy? Just sort of picking up on some of those ideas as a starting place. And listening and understanding that what we're hearing is a real opportunity to then, again, to cultivate a conversation that will bring in people that we know is already interested in that particular conversation.
I think oftentimes too, people forget how interdisciplinary, like the study of theology and divinity are. And so, we've even talked about what would a community organizer or a CEO of a business or something like that have? What is it that we could offer them? What is it that we have expertise in, that we could offer that they might not necessarily have considered to tap us for, but we have knowledge and expertise and resources in. And so that's also how we're thinking about this too, is, again, back to this idea of a pipeline. This is having a solid lifelong learning program. I think, as a communicator, this is another way for them to interface with us as an institution. And they might not necessarily have ever thought, well, what do I care about divinity or a seminary or religious education? But I think this is where those intersections really are useful. And we even forget to talk that up sometimes ourselves, because, I think there are a lot of principles that organizers or activists might find useful, but might not necessarily care to have anything to do with the church, right? And so I think, but the minute we begin to think about sort of those extensions and those like tentacles, the more broadly and deeply we can think about how and why this matters and to whom.
That's interesting, Erica, what you said, thinking about the audience, or if that's a secondary question. Yeah, so we led with that because, and maybe this is because some of us have been in corporate settings as well, but it's difficult to put much effort into anything if it will not help anyone or if no one shows up. If you build it, they do not come unless it's something that they really want. And so we thought about that. And then we thought about all of the different audiences. My colleagues have already referred to that, because we have a background in thinking about the folks that we're educating as like public leaders. So some congregational, some chaplains, some in the academy, and a lot in the public sphere. Thinking about how do we serve a lot of those different audiences? What can we offer for each of them that's within our area of expertise? I think that can be fraught, especially for those of us who work with faculties who have a lot of energy and expertise to bring themselves. I will say that while the faculty, and actually this is kind of segueing into the next part, is they're enthusiastic, but they also have plenty to do already. And so in some ways, because of that, we know that we can get people to do things, but we don't feel like we are pressured to do anything in particular, that we can still be kind of like, we can follow where the interest really is, rather than, okay, we'll just let that person do that. So I know that sometimes that can happen as well. I'm not saying that's what's happening with you. I'm just saying that can happen.
Laura, I think that's a really great point. Can I just add one thing real quick? You mentioned our faculty, and the truth be told, like a lot of our faculty already have a following. And so, and we have to be honest about that. Like a lot of our faculty are known, and, I'm thinking, I don't want to name names, right? But I am thinking about particular people whom we all know. And so, that's a part of the consideration too. Like if faculty already have a following, if there are people that are already plugged into, jumping on webinars with them when they show up in other towns and cities, we want to make sure that at the very least we're listening to that, and if we can cultivate that. One of the considerations we've had to be honest about too is that the investment all the way around, this is an investment. And so, I think at the beginning stages, we might not be able to necessarily reward or or honor folks for the time, that time commitment. But anyways, the point is that the point is that for a lot of our experts, the audiences are already there. And what we're having to do is just, continue to cultivate that and prime the pump. We've talked some, I'll just say this real quick and then I'll shut up. But we've talked some about, sort of the remix, right? I think it was Sophia that was talking about interdisciplinary. Again, we have the benefit of the university and thinking broadly about that and what it might look like for religion and the sciences to do, really interesting, sort of webinars on meditation in the brain, something like that. But in each of our schools, we can think about, what's the remix look like? What might it look like for our Bible faculty? What might it look like for our Bible faculty to do something with the ethics folks, particularly around the question, we might say around the question of what are the roots of, sort of this relationship between religion and politics. Are there ancient roots that we can, so anyway, the list goes on and on, but yeah, I just wanted to throw in that point about audience, because I think that when we started with that question, we were already thinking about who's interested in us. Who do we know is interested in us from the data that we've collected about students, the data that we have from folks that have participated in other things, and then with, sort of listening to the chat, and who are those new conversation partners. But audience is definitely a thing, and we'll kind of jump around to this at the end, but it's definitely a thing when we're thinking about success, which is, it's one of those business buzzwords that we don't necessarily want to think about, but we do want to measure, right? We do want to measure success. And so we'll come back to that.
So we also, to keep this going, because not one person kind of owns this, well, kind of Amy does, but because we all have these other jobs, to keep this going, we did have to figure out, like, okay, why does this matter? And why should people care? And that's another one of our guiding questions. If this has to matter, otherwise, why would people show up? I think we've all noticed our own energy waning the longer the pandemic goes and the more crises there are. And so really honing in on what that is for ourselves as well as for the institution has been important for us to help prioritize the work. We also learned that we could just start with the people who already have the content. As we mentioned before, we have several co-curricular programs. We have faculty members who actually do some of this online digital teaching or workshops already. And they have stuff that's fairly easily able to be translated into this kind of setting. So that way we don't have to stress about asking like the most prominent person on faculty to produce something in a format with which they're unfamiliar. We could start with the folks who have stuff ready to go and move from there, because, there are different audiences for everything, right? We also, because of who we are and because of who Vanderbilt is, decided to imagine also the marginalized audiences who may not be best served by other lifelong learning or by lifelong learning even that Vanderbilt did before, who's been left out of previous conversations, who is the religious public now. It's pretty different now than, say, the 90s in terms of who the religious public is and who is really in need of some of these conversations. And we kind of knew this, but of course kept learning as we were talking with our colleagues and especially with the faculty, that there are tons of ideas about potential partners and collaborators. It's more a matter of us asking folks and then figuring out from there, how do we prioritize or narrow that down? But the nice thing, we had to slow down because of the work the university is doing. And that actually forced us then to be able to be like, okay, let's go ahead and take all of the information we can, take some time to imagine, and then start to move forward first with some beta testing audiences. And then we can figure out how to go from there. because at this point we can try things. Actually, it's relatively low risk to try something and learn from it.
All right, so now to the question of expectations, right? So, and measuring success, which are questions that, you know, if you've ever been a grant a director or director of a grant, you know that these questions are embedded in the work. And so we wanted to, and we have been encouraged to think about these, you know, to think about our expectations and our measures of success in particular ways. And again, I think this would be a really rich part of the conversation to get, you know, to sort of begin talking together about what success looks like. And maybe even to talk about who are our stakeholders and who are the people that get to help us determine what success looks like. So just kind of keep those in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to them. But we're sort of thinking about, you know, our internal measurements. You know, are we okay with saying, all right, y'all, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, that's fine. You know, we've we've been successful that we've gotten 2 folks. Do numbers really matter? Are numbers really a measure of success? Is money? You know, Sophia has been really good with sort of reminding us that, particularly now in this period, this sort of early stage, that we are not as tied to or compelled by our abilities for this to be sort of a money, you know, what do they call those things? Like a money machine. We really want to, you know, spend this time exploring and not really be vested in making money. So maybe money is not a measure of success. Is the number of our course offerings, is that a measure of success? You know, are the number of courses that we offer, does that make us feel like we've been successful, that we can offer not 1 or 2, but offer 10 in the course of a year? So these are questions that we're asking ourselves. Maybe in our sort of our understanding of success and our expectations, maybe what we're really after are not the quantitative, the quantitative numbers, but the qualitative stories. So are there anecdotal stories that will deepen our story of success that we can tell ourselves, that perhaps we can tell, you know, the larger public? And then, you know, also, is there an evaluation form? Is there a survey? And then what does that look like? One of the things that our collaborators from the university have really helped us to begin to think about is sort of starting with the end in mind. They're helping us to understand how to ask and how to develop the essential questions and really prioritize our learning outcomes. And what we mean by that is just sort of determining from the beginning with each of the courses and webinars, what are our overarching understandings that we want each learner to leave with. And when we start with very specific questions, then, you know, that really get at sort of measures of success, when we start our planning with that, then of course that data can later on then be revealed. But beginning to really think about what are these questions, what are the questions that are going to help us tell the story about what was successful in the program. And so, you know, again, we want to turn this back on you and say, well, what are y'all, you know, what measures of success have you used? You know, have there been stakeholders that you've been in conversation with that helped you to determine what that success was? And so again, we can, you can unmute, you can put it in the chat, but we really want to, you know, we want to hear from you all. How are you thinking about success, right? And how are the people that you are working with, collaborating with, how are they helping to shape this conversation about success for this institution in this particular, your institution in this particular branch of what your institution does?
I'm happy to speak up beyond the chat a little to keep things moving, but most, if not all of our institutions are, not for profit. And so one of the conversations that has taken place at my institutions over the years is, we're not for profit. If the degree side had to make a profit, they wouldn't be here either. And so we have appreciated the evolution of what that has looked like to support parts of our budget, personnel, overhead, those kinds of things, and then developing streams of revenue from program fees, grants, some endowment kinds of things, if available, to help make things break even on the event side. And that's probably one of my biggest soapbox that I want to encourage folks is, please don't let people, as I think Amy said, that expect lifelong learning or an advanced degree program to be a money maker or a cash cow, because it ain't gonna happen, people.
Surprise, surprise. That's right. Very helpful. Thank you.
I was thinking a little bit about some of the different ways we've tried to measure success in our program at Austin Seminary. And some of the things we report to the larger institution are, especially when we were doing in-person events, how many new people we brought to the seminary, which is, I think related to exposure to the seminary. I mean, and when we look at it, we bring more people to the seminary than, our regular degree programs, because on a given year, it might be anywhere between 500 and 1,000 people that are coming to our campus pre-virtual education, but that also increases our reach. But and we have everyone who comes do an evaluation, either on paper or electronic. So we kind of get a sense of, what was their biggest takeaway? Did they feel that, their time was worth it? But what I think is harder to measure, at least in some of these one-off events, is transformation. I mean, what we really want is transformation. I think we can get at that better in our cohort-based programs that span over a year or a year and a half, because we can do more of that deep dive, qualitative sort of storytelling and most significant change conversations. But it's hard to know what the transformation is with, a half-day seminar. So it's kind of an open question for us.
If it's helpful, there is a survey that we send out after events that ask more of those kinds of questions. How do you see your work impacted or being transformed by your attendance in this thing? And you can use that for, a half-day seminar, a one-time class thing, or you can use it perhaps for a longer course. But I think even thinking about the types of questions we ask and the data that we want to get is really important, because often, sorry if you hear jumping, it's like PE time for their class. They're doing jumping jacks with things in their pockets, apparently. Tic Tacs, it sounds like. I'll repeat what I said. There is a survey that I'm happy to send out to you that could maybe help be kind of food for thought for you as you think about what questions to ask. But one of the questions that we ask in that survey, and it's just for like attending a workshop, it's not a, we actually use it for workshops and our lectures and a few other events. But the question is something like, how do you envision your work being transformed by your attendance at this thing, right? So we're helping for them to reflect on, how is this impacting your work? Is it or is it not? And we want to know kind of how you envision that to be, like how were we a part of your professional and learning development, right? What else could we offer that might be of interest to you? And so I think when we spend some time thinking about those types of questions and not just the numbers, then we can really have a more holistic picture of the impact that we're making. So yes, we want to know, is this the first event you've attended, or is this the 10th? What else would you like to see? But also, like, what is the perceived impact of what we're doing in the world? And I think those are the kinds of questions that we are beginning to ask more of. And I put a note in this earlier in chat, but like, if you have an institutional planning office in your school, or that you have access to, partner with them, because I think, one, it helps them to understand what we do and perhaps rethink the types of data that they're collecting, but it helps us then think beyond sort of our bubble to think like, oh, maybe we're not asking, there are different questions that we should be asking. And some of this is related to sort of that backward design, right? Thinking about what the outcomes and goals and things are before we even begin to plan some of the stuff. But what would we consider a successful course or offering or event? And then kind of building it backwards to see like, okay, if this is what we hope for them to learn or to take away, then this is what that particular offering has to contain. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was listening to, it's very hard to find metrics for a lot of the success we want to measure. It's very hard to say, we saw an uptick in the effectiveness of the ministers who took our course, largely because I don't know how to measure that. I imagine you don't either. We measure things like the numbers. We also measure into things like repeats and referrals. If somebody comes back to do refresher courses regularly, then you think you're meeting their needs. If we see our number of boundary violations go down, then we hope our boundaries courses are having an effect. But sometimes it's very hard to draw a straight line between cause and effect with a lot of the courses we're teaching. Our racial justice courses, how do I know if they've been effective? People come back for more. I guess that's one way to measure it, but I don't know how to measure it otherwise.
We had a conversation with one of the instructional designers at Vanderbilt, and we often forget that assessment, even within the course, is a thing. And so she was asking us, for example, how would you know, say you offered a course, and this is not quite the example she gave, I can't remember the example she gave. If we offered a course on, implicit bias, or on, undoing institutionalized racism, what are the markers of someone who would have successfully completed that and then embodies and actually incorporates that course into their work? So even thinking about, are there specific questions or measures that we could assess now or over time that could help us understand better the impact of that course or that offering? And so as much as like sometimes we forget, like, collecting data is so important, and it doesn't have to be in like, oftentimes it feels icky and boring, and that's why we shy away from it. But I think if we are hand in hand planning the course, as well as like what data and assessment go along with that and would be important to collect, I think then it can feel like a more cohesive process, and that it's not done after the fact, but we're doing it alongside, right? And oftentimes, of course, it's not going to match because we thought about it after the course was designed, and we should have probably thought about that from day one. So again, back to plugging, if you have access to someone who does any sort of institutional assessment, that they could be a good conversation partner as you develop what that could be like for you. And also there's like denominational things too, right, that could inform what that is.
I think that's a really great point, Sophia. And I also think that, sometimes it is a question as simple as how has your mind changed? What in the course, for instance, use your example on maybe implicit bias, how did the course change your mind about bias? And can you give an example? I'm sort of now thinking about survey or evaluative data collection, asking, and how might this information, how might you employ this information in your daily life or in your leadership responsibilities? Those are the kinds of open-ended questions that I think are really helpful, that we've been trying to because yes, I'm sorry, I gotta this is the Zoom. This is the Zoom world. I've gotten a direct message, but so I'm communicating, sorry, with two different audiences. But yeah, sort of those open-ended questions that really kind of help, sort of tell a story about a person who took a course and who was transformed by that course. And then, the more data that we collect, the deeper that story is. But I think to your point, Stephen, that, these are evaluation and, measuring transformation is difficult. I think, was it Erica, someone else mentioned this as well, that those are the more difficult questions that are the most impactful answers, right?
Well,
I do evaluation in a couple of different ways. One of them would be for my boss. And that's very much numbers driven. How much money came in, how many people registered, how many of those are repeat and referral. And the other kind of evaluation would be for the people who wrote the curriculum. And that's when we ask at the end of the program, what did you like about the content? What was the most valuable learning? Where did you get bored? Some of those kinds of things, which are really helpful in terms of shaping the next iteration of the same program. But part of figuring out which evaluation tool I want is figuring out what does my audience want to know. And my boss who pays my salary wants me to have something that's very cut and dried and usually financial. And that's of no use to the pedagogy design.
Well, and building in layers, if depending on what the design thinking, what the goals are, those kinds of things, if we're helping people think critically and self-assess, and in the course itself we're asking the questions like, what's the big idea that you're going to take away? How do you intend to practice this tomorrow, 2 months from now? And then if we ask that in the evaluation right after the course, that reinforces that we're serious. And then if, depending on the course and if it's a cohort or the kind of learning, dropping, because of the tools we have with technology, we can drop a follow-up survey in a quarter, in 6 months, to say, remember that big idea we asked you about? How's it going for you? Or have you had another aha instead? Please tell us, because that can help the numbers people hear the transformative stories that we've all talked about, and that as Erica, so that's the bottom line. We hope for transformation.
And don't forget too that these are all opportunities for you to gather really testimonials with their permission, right? So you're hearing directly from folks who have engaged with you in this way about the value. And I think there is a translation of that anecdotal stuff into numbers, because and then you're equipping your president, dean, leadership with things that they can pull out and kind of share with others who want to know what you're doing there. And so you're serving a few different purposes by gathering good data.
These are all good notes here. And before we transition to our very last question, I just wanted to come back to something that Erica said, I think it was, about, yeah, the question is a part of the strategy of learning. And yeah, and to the point that I've, sort of in response to that in the chat, that yeah, these questions are a part, should really lead our educational design strategy, not to be thought of, I think we've said this before, but not to be thought of as, sort of after the fact, after sort of a post evaluation, but that we really are considering these questions even in the educational design, right? Which is a different kind of, and we've been challenged to think about this differently too. And I think it's a really helpful question.
So our last question for you all to ponder. I had it and then I moved my screen. It's totally fine. What is your why? Like, why do you do lifelong learning? Why is your institution committed to it? And what partners have been helpful to the development of the program? That last one, we're just curious.
And I will also say we can also use this as an opportunity to go back to other conversations that we might not have addressed or had time to dig a little bit deeper.
I'll kick it off. I guess from my perspective, I see us as equipping leaders for the church that is. And the church is constantly changing. Times that we're living in are changing, and none of us were trained for the institutions that we're now serving. And we need to provide opportunities for church leaders to gather and reflect and learn from each other and from the situations they're in, and address some of the loneliness of being a church leader, because it is frequently a very lonely profession. So those would be a couple of my whys.
I've been influenced a lot by peer-to-peer and dialogical models, and that it's not just the sage on the stage, but there is much to commend learning that encourages learners to be co-learners, whether it has the designated leader facilitator or encourages learning from everyone in the room. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest shifts that I have seen in the 17, 18 years I've been doing this work. And I think it is also potentially the most vocationally sustaining, whether it's a paid church professional or the other partner in the conversation, the person that wants to know more to as part of their own formation, whether it's a denominational or as to use that the lay leader term. So that matters to me.
It's Barbara again. Actually, I just happen to love learning, and I think in our profession it actually should be mandated in the same way it is for doctors, nurses, pharmacists, to stay abreast of new technologies, new and different, if I want to say, interpretations, new methodologies, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know why we don't mandate it in theological education for pastors, religious educators in the church to have so many hours of ongoing education to stay informed.
This is Rick.
Is someone responding to me, or I'm sorry, I heard a voice that was me.
Oh,
I was trying to get on the, this is Rick Rouse, and I'm not somehow coming up on the screen, but I just wanted to reiterate what I put in the chat, that it keeps our institutions focused outward as we see ways to partner with our churches, our denominations, and how we can be an agent of transformation to practitioners and others.
You know, one of the things that we've talked about too is that those who would lead some of our lifelong learning courses aren't just faculty, but we have expertise in both our alumni and our staff. And so to have this be an opportunity to show that and for folks to access that knowledge, I think is a really exciting opportunity.
I think a lot of the courses that we teach are about honing and deepening judgment as opposed to conveying data. I just spent 2.5 hours today teaching a course on retiring with grace. And it falls within our stable of courses for personal and professional boundaries. And of course, we had to teach some information about the denomination's policy around sexual abuse and misconduct and what happens when you cross the line, because otherwise it's not a boundaries course that qualifies as a refresher. But most of our time is spent looking at case studies and inviting people to reflect and think and ponder together. And in the middle of that, they hone their judgment. I think you can get facts out of a book, but judgment comes as you wrestle together with the hard aspects of ministry.
And with people showing up in our rooms who are not necessarily the same people that showed up before because they're not geographically bound, we can have different kinds of conversations with different voices and perspectives represented. And I wonder if that could be one of the more intentionally exciting as well as transformative kinds of work that we could collaborate doing. I don't have an answer, but it's something that interests me a lot.
Well, we do hope that this has provided all of us with more questions than answers, which frankly is what all of our institutions should do, but provided some ongoing conversation for everyone. A good launching pad.
Good launching pad for you all and for the new year to keep us thinking. I would like to add my thanks to the crew at Vanderbilt. And I know that you are not necessarily representative of the football tradition with anchoring down and all that, but when you talked about anchoring your commitments, being grounded and rooted and knowing when to move the anchor is part of the work that we all do. And I appreciate this first conversation in the new year and the expertise and imagination and the encouraging the questions, because there is no one size fits all for this work for any of us. We are getting close to our end. It is 4:54 in my time zone. Are there any last questions to put in the chat that anyone would like to bring up before we sign off?
I will just add, we're happy to share whatever resources we might have referenced, and that survey that we send out, we can send you a blank copy of it so you can kind of see the questions that we ask, and then you're free to modify it and use it as you wish.
And we can send it out with the survey, with the recording when we do our follow-up. And if anyone else has survey tools that they would like to share, send them. I'll put my email.
You know what, they could respond to the confirmation of registration email. That might be easier.
Right.
And,
Just respond. Yeah, thanks.
yeah.
Respond to that and we'll
Yes.
collect them and send them or post them.
Sure.
A brief commercial for our next webinar featuring Lakeisha Lockhart, February 9th at
3 p.m.
3
Eastern
p.m.
Time.
At what, 2 p.m.?
2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern.
Right.
Isn't that right? Yes, I think so. Yes.
So we would love to
On the
see,
West Coast.
we would love to see you there again, because to foster this kind of collaboration and to know who we are in this work together is what Alum has long been about, and to work for transformation in lifelong learning.
Mhm.
So we would like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, your two other people on your opening slides who are part of your team. I can picture their faces and I can't recall their names, but thank you for the work you are doing and for sharing your tripod model and your commitment to collaboration with us today.
Thank you so much, y'all. Thank you. Thank you for the
Good being with you
invitation.
all.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Bye.
Bye.